I'm Linda Tran. Last time I was here, the room was standing room only, so I'm just going to chalk it up to the fact that lunch just happened and people are going to be flowing in here soon. So our conversation today is about advanced air mobility, or urban air mobility, as others may call it, and specifically the potential for these amazing, game-changing technologies to really lead us into a carbon-neutral future. The conversation's going to go much like a lot of these panels have gone, where I will have some questions for our esteemed panelists here today, but then we're also just going to have an open, free-ranging conversation. All that said, just to get us started, we have a little bit of entertainment to get us rolling here. The first thing we want to show you is a video from Leonardo Helicopters, which is a little bit of a spin. Actually, the other one, Brian, first. A little bit of a spin, pun intended, new take on some existing aircraft that you all have seen before. And then we're going to see a little bit on Archer and then get underway. So not your daddy's helicopter. The second video we're going to see very quickly here is from Archer.
I'm coming home.
And there you have it. So let us get underway with some introductions here. Why don't we start to my right with John Porcari.
Thanks, Linda. Hi, I'm John Porcari. I'm a board member of Vantage Airport Group. We operate 10 airports around the world and served as Deputy Secretary of USDOT.
Nikhil?
Hey everyone, good afternoon. Nikhil Goyal here, Chief Commercial Officer of Archer Aviation. Prior to this, I was at Uber, where I founded our aviation group back in 2015.
And Bill?
Good afternoon. Bill Sonic, Head of Chillwater Marketing for Leonardo Helicopters.
Great, and I realized I didn't actually introduce myself, really. So until a few weeks ago, I was Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Transportation and Director of Public Engagement. So I was also, as part of that role, part of the Advanced Air Mobility Interagency Working Group, which is a collaboration across a number of different cabinet agencies and the White House, and that is why I'm sitting here. Why don't we get started with a round robin of what you all would describe as advanced air mobility. We just got a chance to see some of it in action, but there's a very, very wide array, and I think it'd be helpful to just kind of ground folks in what it means. Why don't we start with you, John?
Sure. Well, advanced air mobility is the umbrella term for a lot of technologies and a lot of what's going on, including electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. There's unmanned aerial vehicles of all kinds. There's a lot of work going on. It's maybe the most exciting time since the era of the Wright brothers in terms of aviation and aerospace and what's actually happening. It's important to point out, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit, Linda, but what this means for cities and towns all across America, not just the major cities, but what it means in terms of mobility in a way that we have never had in the United States.
Thank you. Nikhil?
Yeah, for me, it's really about bringing electric technology to airplanes. A lot of people ask me, hey, why is all of this happening now? Why are people doing drone deliveries in Texas? Why are people flying cars in California? Why is all of this happening today? And it really comes down to the battery. So if you look at everything that's happened in electric vehicles over the last decade, all of that is about to come to aviation. And it's really coming from a lot of the same places. It's coming from Silicon Valley, where you see Tesla and Apple engineers starting to work on flying cars, working on drones, working on newer technologies. And so I'm really excited for the next 20 years and how that manifests, whether it's food deliveries, whether it's blood deliveries, whether it's stuff for the US military, or whether it's passenger transportation. And I think that's what we'll talk about today.
Thank you. And Bill, tell us about the evolution too, especially from the perspective of Leonardo having
Sure.
this legendary history in the helicopter industry.
Sure, thank you. So for us, when we think advanced aerial mobility, our focus is on that aircraft you saw in the first video, the AW609, the tilt rotor. So you'll hear me talk a lot about tilt rotors, and it's not just branding or anything, because they are a specific class, a specific category under powered lift of aircraft type. And they really excel when your mission absolutely positively requires you to go far, fast, and vertical all in that same flight, right? So if you have to go far and fast, airplanes, they're most efficient means of transportation. I did it this morning coming down here, probably about, between around 1,300 nautical miles. Great. If I need to go far and have to go vertical in my flight, we could talk helicopters with extended range fuel tanks, right? And there's lots of great aircraft out there. But then my mission, if it requires that I absolutely positively have to do all three, now I'm talking a tilt rotor, and ours in particular excels at those ranges between 50 and 500 nautical miles. So under 50 nautical miles, it's surface transportation, right? Over 500 nautical miles, it's an airplane. That's the most efficient means of transportation. But in between there, and you have to take a step back and holistically look at transportation, right? Point to point will always win the day. So growing up, right, if you're like me, you wanted to beam me up, Scotty, right? And we all know, what I mean when I say that, right? Well, we're not there. However, that means of transportation, point to point, is the most efficient, and that's where you get tremendous synergies and savings. So for us, that I can literally take off from point A, wherever that is, a major metropolitan downtown city. So for me, I'm driving to an airport that, with a 6,500-foot runway, even though as a crow flies, it might, maybe 20, 25 nautical miles. This morning, it took me an hour. Okay, that's inefficient. And then I hopped on an airplane, and that took me 3 hours. So just starting, before I landed in Miami, 1/3 of my airplane travel was consumed by surface transportation. And then I had to take, a car from Miami International over to here. So holistically, you have to sum all that up, because that counts, right? And there's a signature associated with that. So when we can be more efficient and go point to point, there's tremendous savings there.
Thanks, Bill. And John, when I'm thinking about the challenges now, right? So there's clearly a lot of promise. It's very exciting. I'm sure there are a lot of folks that are in this room who would love to hop into some of these aircraft in the near future, but there's some challenges around the infrastructure as well. Maybe you talk us through a little bit about that.
Yeah, there are real short-term challenges on the infrastructure side. I would include in the infrastructure discussion the certification process as well. So we have to get these air vehicles actually out there certified and in service, and then we have to have the infrastructure that actually supports it. And when you're talking about electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, there's, from an airport perspective and from a community perspective, they bring tremendous benefits in terms of carbon reduction, but also in terms of serving communities that can't economically be served by fixed-wing aircraft today. And it requires a change in mindset on the facilities side, on the education and training, on the work that's done at the Federal Aviation Administration to actually get these air vehicles certified. I think it's fair to say that it's taken a couple of twists and turns and some unusual U-turns during the process, but there's a pathway now on the federal process, and beyond that, there is a larger national strategy that Linda alluded to that's on an interagency basis across the whole of government at the federal level that provides great economic development opportunities that we can maybe talk about a little more across the board for communities across America.
Yeah, and I would say if there were a current representative of the federal government sitting here, John and I both served at the U.S. Department of Transportation, both together and then separately and then together again. They would say that one of the things they're thinking about is just pilot demonstrations and issues like noise mitigation and how does that all work into a federal strategy for AAM that is productive but also helps to kind of continue to supercharge this tech. I'm thinking, Nikhil, about the fact that you went from Uber to now Archer. And there must have been a reason, a feeling of how near term the benefits were. Maybe you could talk us through that as well. And also, how soon can we expect to be riding around in an Archer aircraft?
It's a great question. When I was at Uber back in 2015, very few people in the world knew the term eVTOL. Very few people thought that the flying car was anything other than what we saw in Blade Runner or Back to the Future. And what we were able to do was really help popularize the technology that actually a few folks were developing. Larry Page was building a flying car. Joe Ben Beavert was building an eVTOL. So there were people working on this. What we were able to do was get it out into the mainstream. And back then, we sort of looked at it from first principles and we said, how long is it going to take for a few dominant designs to emerge? How long is it going to take to work with the FAA and the DOT to make sure we can get the aircraft certified? We looked at programs from Bell, from Leonardo, from a number of others. We said, look, it'll take roughly 8 years. And so we put out there that by 2023, the world would have flying cars and we launch in our first cities. I don't think we were too far off. Right now, our assessment with the FAA, with the new administrator, Mike Whitaker, who actually came from the industry, is actually 2025. And so if you take COVID and other things, that's not too far off. So my expectation is that by the end of next year, by the end of 2025, you will, in the United States and other places in the world, be able to actually buy a fare, buy a trip on an electric VTOL and take it from point A to point B and pay for that trip. And that's a really big deal. I think we're almost there. Today, I'll tell you at Archer, our aircraft are flying 10 to 15 times a day. Literally, you can come out with us, you can see the plane fly, you can see it not only sort of hover, but do other missions, and you're only going to start seeing more of that. You'll start seeing it in places like Miami and New York, and abroad as well. So I'm excited about the next couple of years.
Thank you. How about on the Leonardo side?
I'd take a step back and look at the regulatory environment, right? And so this year is a big year for us on the powered lift, and mentioned that before. That's the overarching category of aircraft types that these aircraft fall under. There's a special federal aviation regulation coming out that will govern the operations and the pilot training aspects of this. And so there's all eyes on that because there's tremendous efficiencies to be had on that. So that will really help, right? The way that these aircraft are properly employed and optimally employed.
John, you in particular have this perspective of the policymaking aspect of all of this. What are you hoping to see these guys do to make sure that all of those things that we laid out, the promise of the technology, the mobility aspects of it, the equity aspects of it, come to fruition?
It's a great question because first on the equity part, there's a dimension to equity that we don't often think about, which is in the aviation sector, there's really unequal service and no service for large parts of America. There's a federal government program, for example, called the Essential Air Service Program. We spend about $200 million a year subsidizing air travel to a couple of select airports around the country at an enormous cost per passenger. Doesn't serve the passengers well, certainly doesn't serve the country well. The idea that there's a better model and an economic model and an electric model that's better in environmental terms that can actually economically serve small communities and in a hub and spoke or a feeder operation in a way that you can't do today is really exciting. So if you think about what that means, for example, for exurban and rural communities around the United States, just for air travel, it really opens up some possibilities. It's a little outside the scope of what we're talking about today, but there are 9 to 19 seat commuter aircraft, electric commuter aircraft being developed right now and being actually tested in some cases. So the idea of equity in serving more communities through that kind of service is really important. There's also another dimension that we really haven't talked about now, which is the emergency medical services part of it. And we can talk about that a little bit more. But in my home state, Maryland, when you register your passenger vehicle, you pay a $14 surcharge. That surcharge pays for what is today a statewide medevac helicopter system, Leonardo Helicopters, run by the state police, staffed by paramedics, where you're guaranteed to get to a level 1 trauma center from anywhere in the state within the golden hour. And in most cases, within 30 minutes.
What does that mean, the golden hour?
The golden hour in medical terms is for trauma patients, it's your best opportunity to actually save a life. And if you can get them to a level 1 trauma center within 1 hour, the outcomes are dramatically different. So think about a rural area today that isn't served that way at all. Think about what advanced aerial mobility, what an eVTOL, for example, could do in that life-saving role. That's just one additional dimension to the possibilities for it that matter. A whole lot of other things that come with the rollout of advanced aerial mobility in the U.S. as well, including in economic development terms, the design, the manufacture, the service and support, the kind of good-paying family-supporting jobs that come with it. And frankly, the U.S. needs to be the world leader in this.
Thank you. And from the industry perspective, Bill, Nikhil, what are you hoping? The federal government is probably listening right now. What are you hoping they take away from this in terms of just kind of paving the way?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, follow up on John's comments, EMS, right? We have a lot of operators in extremely remote areas that don't have sophisticated hospital, even a level 1 trauma center. So they are doing some amazing and Herculean things to make recoveries. So they'll take at a very, very remote area, at a point of injury, they'll bring a helicopter in there to pick up the injured person and bring them back to a small rural airport, right? Then a fixed-wing airplane, right, a small, probably twin turboprop type airplane, will pick them up and then fly to a major metropolitan city, right, and land at their airport. And then from there, they'll take another helicopter and go to that, that specialized care center. It could be an eye center, a burn center, or a level 1 trauma center, right? Those hospitals just don't exist out in the extremely rural areas. So you just kind of rewind there, and that's 3 different aircraft types, right? And that is extremely, extremely inefficient. And they're not flying as a crow flies, right? They're flying, kind of the lily pads just to get, eventually down to that major metropolitan hospital. So, again, point to point is the most efficient means of transportation. Tremendous savings from the operator side there, and efficiencies. But then you look on the clinical side, and it's huge. And this is an area that we really, really are seeing a lot of interest. Patient loading and unloading cycles. If you ever saw a patient being loaded on a stretcher into an aircraft, it's pretty involved, and you'll see the patient up on a wheeled stretcher with lots of wires, cables, medical devices attached to them. There's a lot of, it looks like a big pile of spaghetti, right? And it's wires, everything. And then if you're where I live in the Northeast, where it's cold a lot, they're pushing that individual up a ramp system to get them into the cabin on an icy tarmac, right? And that's very treacherous, and unfortunately, it's not easy. And the mission I just described, that would take 6 cycles, right? Patient loading and unloading, or 3 total, right? Versus one patient loading into an aircraft that can go far, fast, and vertical, right, at that point of injury, and then go all the way down to that specialized care center, right, burn center, eye center. And then with the 609, we're finding out, again, from the clinical perspective, if I had an aircraft that had a pressurized cabin, the doctors love that because there's lots of injuries out there that require that, injuries to the lung, to the brains, that they need sea-level standard pressure. So, and then once you start to fly off the wing, you can actually, because you're in a low vibratory environment and not a helicopter, right, flying off of rotating blades, you can actually start administering a higher level of care if you had to, right, God forbid, on that aircraft. If there was all of a sudden a clogged airway that you had to jump in there.
So lots of life-saving potential. Nikhil, bring us back to climate here. So we've talked a lot about the equity, we've talked a lot about the policy making and larger implications of AAM. But obviously everybody's here because they care about the planet and they want to understand the sustainability aspects of this. Maybe you could talk us through what you're thinking there.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that when I wake up and go do my job gets me really excited, because everything we're doing is all electric from day one, and at least at the local level, that means zero emissions. But more importantly, sort of on the large scale, what I'm really excited about is decarbonizing all of the air travel that happens in the country and in one day in the world. This is a small step towards that. And as I spoke about earlier, what's really exciting is today the batteries are at a place where finally you can put them into an airplane, you can go certify that with the FAA, you can carry 4 or 5 humans from A to B. The good news is those batteries improve 5 to 7% a year. So today we'll tell you we'll fly 100 miles. Next year we're flying 110, and before you know it, we're no longer an urban solution, but regionally you can fly with batteries. That technology then continues to improve exponentially, and I hope one day in my lifetime we'll fly a wide-body airplane completely on battery power. And the things that does on the ground are also momentous. If we think about all of the infrastructure, one of the things that we've spent a lot of time on over the last year is how do we install electric chargers at scale? And how do we go unify the industry with what's called the common charging standard and have a interoperable approach, not just for our airplanes, but for our competitors, for other types of planes that fly in and out of these airports and out of these hubs. How do we make sure that the grid is up to par, that you're delivering enough power, and that you've got those chargers available? And of course, if you've got all of the companies in the space pushing towards it, what's going to happen? Well, the cost is going to come down, and soon you'll be able to put those in places like rural Arkansas. You'll be able to go put them in places like India, right? I'm going to India next week. The conversations we've had all the way from Prime Minister Modi on down, we're really excited about the sustainability aspect because they say, holy crap, this is a way to effectively leapfrog the infrastructure we have today and go build from electric from day one. And that's really exciting to me. It's what gets me up in the morning. I'd love to ask you, I mean, how did the DOT think about sort of supporting the industry, particularly from a sustainability and equity perspective?
Yeah, it's a very good question. From the perspective of the federal government, obviously we have things that Congress has decided that we had to focus on. So there's something called the Advanced Air Mobility Leadership and Coordination Act, which was what brought together all of the various federal agencies in the White House to very deliberately put together a strategy which in theory should be unveiled within weeks.
Any moment.
Yeah, it's imminent. We've been teasing it for a while. But it's focused on a handful of different things, right? There's the actual cyber security and physical security aspect of the infrastructure, which I'd love to hear John's take on as well. There's thinking about safety, the core mission of the department. The FAA is really fundamentally about not just what happens when things go right and the equity aspects of it, but also what would happen if something went wrong and whether or not there are the right operations and systems in place. So that's what the federal government is thinking through right now, and in theory should be putting out, again, guardrails pretty soon. But John, what do you think from the perspective of the groups that you represent, and especially Nikhil's point about charging infrastructure, which in theory could also serve other types of craft, ground craft as well as aircraft? What are you guys thinking about?
Well, first, Nikhil said the magic phrase, which is common standard. We don't want to make the same mistake we collectively made with vehicles on the ground with different charging standards. And starting from that common standard is really important. It's one very visible and important, but only one part of the aviation infrastructure that has to be decarbonized. And if you think about some of the other work that's going on, complementary work at airports right now, it's decarbonizing on the air side, the ground handling fleet, on the terminal side. It's everything from the shuttle buses, the taxi fleets, the maintenance vehicles, all being electrified in the short term, decarbonized various ways in the longer term as part of a total package. And that also includes the central heating and power plants for those. So if you think about it, common standards, U.S. manufacturing where possible, opens the door to facilities, eVTOL, advanced aerial mobility facilities in general, that we typically can't have today, and that if you're going to support with partial federal funding to build, would really require this kind of common standards. So we're early enough in this process where we can maximize the public benefits through standardization, through some of the policy issues that didn't exist even a couple of years ago, such as manufacturing as much as possible here in the United States, maximizing the protection of intellectual property, making sure that to the extent possible, the entire life cycle of the air vehicles are as U.S. Built as possible. Those are ways to capture the economic value in the U.S. and maximize the economic development potential.
I realize that in the introduction to you, John, we didn't mention that you were also the port and supply chain envoy in the midst of our supply chain crisis. So of course, John's thinking about all the ways that we keep things, here within our bounds. I can't help but think about the partnerships aspect of all this. It's an issue that's very near and dear to my heart. As we talk about this common charging standard across different types of craft, et cetera, how are you all thinking about the types of partnerships that you need to have in order to carry out this work in a meaningful way?
So from a supplier network, second and third tier suppliers, right? Yeah, we work closely with them, and COVID and the effects, right, are still lingering, and so that is a bit of a challenge. So if you're building an aircraft and only one manufacturer, makes that widget you need on that aircraft, and that widget is the only one that's certified and compliant with your aircraft design and production, that's a problem, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's an engine or a cotter pin, right? If that's the only one out there. So yeah, it's being close and candid, right? And working together. Obviously, suppliers want to sell lots of widgets, and we want to buy them. But yeah, really, and trying just to balance the forecast with the demand and things like that. So it's a bit of a juggling act.
Yeah, look, we couldn't do this without really incredible partners. There's three sort of areas that are really incredible to us. The first is around demand, particularly airlines. If you think about it, more and more airports around the world are moving away from the city center. Airlines are getting more and more competitive with one another, and so they're really looking for ways to provide differentiated service to their passengers and ways to get to and from the city. And so United Airlines has been a partner with us since day one. They bought $1.5 billion worth of aircraft, and we'll start deploying those in New York, Miami, LA, all across the country. So United's a big one. In India, we partnered with Indigo Airlines, sixth largest airline in the world, the market leader in the Southeast. They're in over 200 cities across India. I personally think that India is going to be the largest market for this anywhere in the world. It was for Uber, and I think it will be for urban air mobility as well. So we're really excited to go launch there and go spread across the country. Partnering with governments is really important, not just here in the U.S., but abroad. So in the UAE, we announced a partnership with the Abu Dhabi Investment Office to go launch in Abu Dhabi and Dubai as soon as next year, which has been really fun for us. Manufacturing is super critical to what we're doing because to what a lot of us have talked about today, this cannot be just a rich person's toy. It's ultimately got to be accessible to everyone in this room and beyond. The way you do that is you manufacture at scale and you lower costs. So we partnered up with Stellantis, third largest automaker in the world, the maker of brands like Jeep, Ram, Maserati, a number of others. And they're building a factory for us just outside of Atlanta that'll make 2,000 plus aircraft a year. And as you can imagine, being able to do that will lower the cost substantially. And then the fourth is how do we get people thinking about this technology and realizing that it's coming soon? And so we've been really fortunate to have a number of celebrities around the world come to us and say, hey, we want to showcase flying cars and what we're doing in our music and our movies and our TV shows. So you saw the Usher spot we just did. We were recently in a Kygo music video. We've got a number of those, and we're in the fortunate position to do, I don't like calling it marketing, but really these partnerships where we're not spending any money. We're hosting really incredibly talented people with megaphones and saying, hey, let's go together, tell the narrative of how this is going to shape people's lives.
And Nikhil, you just talked about some of the work that you're doing internationally, but candidly, a lot of the conversations we had from the federal government perspective were really about American competitiveness. How would you describe that, John?
Well, first, as the nation that invented aviation, I think we do have to have a leadership position in this, and there is that commitment to it. If you look at some of the early R&D funding, either directly through NASA or other partners, there's been a significant public investment over the years that helped seed all this activity that's out there. Going forward, we really want to make sure that the benefits are maximized throughout the whole value chain. And then again, from a public policy perspective, kind of opening the doors for air mobility that simply don't exist for large geographic parts of the United States right now, because that really is an important component as well. And when you put those together, this is a really important new node or method of mobility that simply didn't exist before. And so we want to do everything we can to maximize that, but at the same time, do it differently than the rest of the transportation system evolves. So as Nikhil mentioned, starting with an electric future from day one with this is an important differentiation from where we are on surface transportation, and we want to make sure that we maximize that difference going forward.
So just a couple more questions, and then I'm going to turn it to the room so you guys get your thoughts ready. First off, these are really interesting, amazing jobs. You know, this is a sector that I might not have known even existed very long ago. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the journey that took you from the places you were before to being here on this stage, starting with you, Bill.
Sure, thanks. So, growing up, I was always interested in aviation. So it just, completely fascinated me. So, I built model airplanes, model rockets, flew them, broke them, fixed them, and did that, cycle lots. So, and then that just naturally, led me to, the studies in that, right? Formal education in that. And so I'd say and then finally employment in this market. So, if this interests you, right, you can't go wrong with any of the STEMs, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. I'm an engineer at heart, and, engineering, in its purest forms is problem solving. So how are we going to solve this problem, right? But yeah, no, I'd encourage it.
Did anyone in the room ever go to space camp as a kid? Well, usually I get a few more, but that's where I grew up. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, home to NASA and to space camp. And so I grew up with literal rocket scientists in my backyard. My dad built missiles for the Army, still does. And so everybody I knew either worked for NASA or had a parent or a friend that did. And it was just I thought it was normal. I just sort of thought the whole country was as oriented around missiles and space and aviation as I was. But it turns out I was just lucky. And so my first job was at NASA. And actually, at the conclusion of that job, I decided no matter what I did when I grew up, it was not going to be in aviation. It's actually a pretty demoralizing experience for me, as sort of a young kid who liked computers. I was like, oh my gosh, the timelines here, not this summer or next year, they're 2035, they're 2050. And for
delayed gratification.
Totally, right? And so for me, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to drive me nuts. And little did I know that it would be 15 years later, when I was at a Silicon Valley company who didn't even think about aviation, that would be the moment where I said, you know what, planes have come a long way, technology's come a long way, whether it's the AI we use in our autopilots, whether it's the batteries that control the airplane, whether it's thinking about chargers and being able to recharge, everything that sort of had to come together, that I finally said, I can now connect the early passion I had for aviation with the fast-moving nature I've always wanted as part of my job. So here we are, and now it's not just us, but it's dozens and hundreds of companies around the world that are getting to do that, and it makes me pretty happy to be able to go back to my roots like that as well.
Super exciting. John.
This is nothing as exciting as Space Camp or Huntsville, but I grew up in Rochester, New York, and the public school I was in 7th grade was kind of a schools without walls. You could make up your own courses, and I scammed my way into working at the control tower at the Rochester airport 1 day a week, and then later in 7th grade taking ground school for pilot's license. And that kind of started the road. And as a state DOT secretary, I had the great fortune of working in a state where the aviation system is part of the DOT. And so BWI Thurgood Marshall Airport and a statewide aviation program were an integral part of our transportation system. And so being able to operationally work through a regional aviation system and a large airport was really important. And then finally at USDOT, it's probably a little known secret, but of the roughly 55,000 employees, 47,000 of them work for the Federal Aviation Administration. It's by far the biggest part of USDOT, and being able to dive into issues like air traffic control modernization through next gen and some of the operational changes was very exciting. And we haven't really touched on it, but there's a very large FAA component of advanced aerial mobility that needs to be done, which is redesigning the airspace. Think of it as rezoning coast to coast of the airspace for more complex, more intense uses that'll better serve the traveling public.
All right, one last question for me. It's 2024, and everywhere I go, I get questions about the different types of work that we do and whether the outcome in November is going to have any impacts. So I'm going to start back with you, Bill. Do you think there's going to be an impact one way or another?
No impact with respect to November. Big impact on the FAA SFAR guidance. So that's what we're waiting for.
Thank you.
I think we're lucky insofar as I don't think the previous administrations have had a massive impact. I don't think future administrations will have a massive impact one way or another. I think having met sort of senior folks in both parties, I think this is an issue where both Democrats and Republicans generally tend to align, that the United States should take the lead in these sorts of technologies, that the FAA should be a relatively apolitical organization and be focused first and foremost on safety and then on innovation and how we move the ball forward in that regard. And I think congressmen and senators and politicians on both sides of the aisle have been incredibly supportive and helpful for us. So I think whoever's in office come November, we're excited to go work with them and make sure that this happens here in America first, sooner rather than later.
Any other thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, I agree. It's actually, luckily, been a very bipartisan space, as some other parts of infrastructure have been as well. I think one thing to watch going forward, though, related to this is the commitment to good government principles of things like process reengineering, of having a clear, simplified, and readily understandable process, whether it's certification, whether it's on the safety side at FAA. That doesn't happen by itself. That starts with a leadership commitment to process reengineering where appropriate. And as you point out, Nikhil, I think with Mike Whitaker and his team leading the FAA, we are very lucky to have exactly that skill set right now.
Great. Questions from the room? Let's start right here. We got a microphone. Just 1 second here, Adam.
I feel lucky to be here and hear about this, and I applaud you guys on what you're doing. And I feel a bit envious, you know, it's just when you talk about aircraft and this change is going on. I'm trying to get a picture in my head of the future, though. And so are we talking about an atmosphere where we have basically what we have now, it's just converted from jet, petroleum-driven kind of aircraft to electric? That's question number one.
What does this look like at scale, I think is what you're getting.
Well, yeah, because what I was thinking of when you first started talking, and I was fascinated and envious, was this will replace the automobile, you know, and I'll be able to go out and just take off and go. And so is that element part of this as well?
I mean, I think some of it, of course, is about mode shift, right?
Yeah, I think there will be some mode shift, and as I mentioned before, it's also fundamentally providing access in some cases where you don't have access now, especially in rural areas. In terms of the technology, we've been talking about electric eVTOL. It's important to note that this is a big umbrella, and under it, for example, fuel cell electric, other hydrogen-powered concepts. There's a lot of it's a truly exciting time in technology terms, because there's a lot of different manufacturers, potential manufacturers with different concepts. It's not just pure electric. And as the electric technology evolves, you'll get more and more range and more competitive energy density out of those batteries. But there are other technologies as well. What we really need to do is make sure we have the policy framework in place, and that's this national strategy on advanced aerial mobility on the federal government side that I mentioned, to encourage as much of this experimentation, research and development, and continued growth as possible.
Yeah, and increased air traffic control, obviously.
Yeah.
They're having trouble now.
Yeah, and I've kind of glossed over it, but there's fundamentally a redesign of what's called the National Airspace System as part of it. I think of it as rezoning, just as like within urban areas, we want more mixed-use zoning, more transit-oriented development. The aviation component of that is making sure that these advanced aerial mobility vehicles can interact, have corridors within the National Airspace System, are compatible. And with the state of technology development today, that's entirely possible. There's a lot of work in redesign, and that's part of the FAA leadership issue that I mentioned that has to take place.
Yeah, and we've been talking about transporting people, but there is also tremendous potential in terms of transporting cargo. Yeah. And John alluded to it. There are lots of different versions of AAM. There are lots of other acronyms apart from eVTOL that will capture some of these other types of aircraft that are, you know, they basically look like regular airplanes, but their cargo space is different, and they are also operating on electric in many cases. So, other questions? Yes. We're just gonna, I'm sorry, making Adam run around with the microphone here.
The military has had some vertical takeoff and landing fatalities, crashes. Can you talk to me about what their situation was and why this might be safer?
Yeah, that's something we actually spend a lot of time with the Air Force on, and I think you should comment as well, because it'd be interesting to hear Leonardo's take. You know, for us, our approach is, look, there's always going to be times when you need a really heavy industrial helicopter to go do some of the stuff that the military does. There's a lot of times when you don't. And so when we go speak to generals in the Air Force or the Army, they tell us, look, even if you're moving 2 soldiers 25 miles in a totally urban, non-war environment, they're still using Hueys or really heavy helicopters that'll cost you $20,000 plus per hour. So it's sort of a waste of taxpayer dollars, it's a waste of military dollars, it's a waste of time. It's really expensive and taxing. So our message to the military on that front has been, hey, for those use cases that are non-weaponized, where you're just moving people around or moving supplies around, use an all-electric, quiet eVTOL. And so we're lucky to have the largest military contract in the sector, maximum value of about $142 million. And that has opened the door for us not only to work with the Air Force, but with the other branches of the armed services. The safety is absolutely critical. I mean, we've all seen photos of Ospreys, whether it's here or in Japan or in other places, and having incidents. And as a taxpayer and as a U.S. citizen, obviously none of us want that. And so our aircraft, you know, so if you look at an Osprey, it's incredibly complicated. It's got these 2 massive tilt rotors, a very complex gear shaft that has to go turn them. I mean, it's sort of a feat of nature that they got it to fly, and an impressive one. Ours, on the other hand, is all electric. It's got 12 all electric rotors, 6 of them that tilt, but they're electric, so that makes them a lot simpler, a lot easier to maintain. It's got 6 moving parts per actuator, and that ultimately makes it an order of magnitude safer, we think, than some of the other alternatives that they have.
Bill, what would you add?
To a certain degree, like icing is going to be a problem for just about any type of aircraft, especially for us, you know, not excluded. Over time, that'll get better. You know, we'll want to start in more temperate climates, temperate conditions. Over time, we'll be able to handle more extreme cold and heat.
Bill, what would you add?
So I can't comment on DoD operations, obviously, as a civilian. But what I can tell you with regard to commercial and Leonardo on our AW609 tilt rotor, you take a step back and look at the certification process that governs our design, right, and construction of the aircraft. If you're familiar with the transport category regulations, are the most robust, safest. So those are the guidelines, the design guidelines that govern airliners, right, that I flew down this morning, or even passenger carrying helicopters. So the failure rates, the safety, inherent safety requirements, and it's quite remarkable, you think about it. So to give you an example, transport category 1 criteria in order to meet that level of safety, which the 609 does, is during that critical moment of takeoff, when the aircraft is at maximum takeoff weight, right? It hasn't burned any fuel, and it has not a lot of airspeed, and it's not a very high off the ground, right? That critical moment, if you lose an engine for some reason, bird strike, whatever, that remaining engine or engines have enough power to spool up and safely transport you out of the way. That's amazing. I mean, let's think about it, because today we can buy a ticket, right, on a commercial airliner and fly nonstop from Sydney to London, which is just remarkable. And so that aircraft, transport category aircraft, right, those design regulations ensure that that aircraft's probably max takeoff weight over 800,000 pounds, right? At that critical moment upon takeoff, it loses an engine, it has enough power and a good engine to fly away. It's remarkable. So, and that criteria is what we design and building the 609 to.
Other questions? Yes, sir. Yes.
Hello. I'm very interested in some of the technical aspects of this. So how big are the batteries in these aircraft? How many kilowatts do the motors consume? And then given that, what type of charging infrastructure is needed? Are you guys building a 1,000-volt structure platform? Are you guys building, chargers that charge at a megawatt to, these, like you said, in your lifetime, you hope to see a wide body aircraft fully on electric. What would the charging requirements for that be require, and how do you get that much electricity to one spot, and how does it compare to traditional refueling with liquid fuels?
I think Nikhil probably has the first word here, but John, you want to jump in as well? Good, Nikhil.
All awesome questions. I can't answer some of them because I'm not the battery expert. But I'll mention a couple of things. So on the batteries, we're developing the battery packs completely in-house. So we hired the head of Tesla's powertrain team, Dr. Michael Swaykuch. Dr. Swaykuch led the powertrain team at Tesla. He then led it at Apple, and now he leads it here at Archer. So, needless to say, he knows what he's doing. And we have worked with him and a lot of the engineers he's brought over to build what we think is a world-class aviation battery pack. We're sourcing the cells from another company, and then we're building the battery pack in-house to be 4 things. One is rapidly recharge. So you want to be able to charge really, really quickly. We've all sort of seen the early electric vehicles that took hours to charge. Our aircraft takes about 8 minutes. So in 8 minutes, you can land, people can get out of the aircraft, new people can get on, and in those 8 minutes, we've charged back up and we're ready to go. That's number one. Number 2 is safety. And so, we've all, again, seen scary videos on the internet. We want to make sure in the case of any sort of incident, that incident still allows passengers to safely sort of exit the vehicle. Okay. Number 3 is high power density, because you're putting these in the air, and so you've got to be really dense, meaning the battery's got to be lightweight so that it can be efficient. And so with all those factors, our batteries we think are top grade. And then on the charging, to your question, these actually don't require a lot of power. In fact, most places in the United States that you'd want to charge, whether it's at an airport, the top of a shopping mall, the top of a parking garage, the waterfront, most of these places, not due to any efforts by us, but simply by what's happening in the world and people wanting to charge their cars, are already well equipped with the right electricity and power to charge our aircraft. So that's not going to be work for us. It's work that will already be done, and we'll take advantage of that work and make sure you can charge our aircraft.
But John, I feel like from the infrastructure perspective, there's a lot of consternation around this, and vertiports and...
There's a lot of work that needs to be done, actually, on nationwide on the electrification side. And it's a part of a larger issue that we have with surface transportation as well. So some of the same utility interfaces, some of the same long-range, long-distance transmission of renewables apply. And we know from work that's going on right now at airports and seaports, for example, the short-term electrification of the ground fleets in both airports and seaports. You're talking about megawatt class charging facilities. You're talking about shore power for ships. These, in almost every case, go well beyond what the substations, local utilities, even regional generating capacity can provide. So you can't look at this in isolation, especially nationally, as we're racing to electrify our transportation system. This is one more load on it. They're all important, but it really puts a premium on the policy side on doing things we haven't done before. Things like public service commissions and state DOTs working together. Things like national policy and direction on building long-distance transmission facilities for renewables. All of those are enablers for the lower carbon electrified transportation economy. This important subset of it is one that we're talking about today, but the same problems apply across it. So the point is the solutions, the capacity issues, the transmission issues, we need to tackle across the board. I think a fair assessment is we are behind the curve on that.
I think I saw a hand here. Yes.
Hi, I'm curious about sustainable aviation fuel. I know that is an emerging market in this aviation space, and I'm curious about how that fits in regards to achieving a carbon neutral future.
Well, SAF, we could have an entire separate panel about sustainable aviation fuel, and I'm sure you know there are a lot of efforts that are underway, buyer side initiatives that are happening across the industry to make sure there's enough demand for it, but lots of experimentation that's happening. I don't know that it actually applies to the group that's here, but I don't know, John, if you want to chime in there.
Yeah, it's a piece of the puzzle. Currently, synthetic aviation fuels are not cost competitive. You do have airlines and others that have made long-term commitments to buying SAFs that will help establish the market. I would point out that the largest purchaser of aviation fuel in the world, the Department of Defense, has actually made significant commitments to do that as a market maker to try to establish that. I don't think there's anyone that's looking closely at this problem that believes, at least in the short term, it'll be more than a niche solution. You have, coming from the other end, what you've heard from the panel today, which is the electrification of aviation will get broader and deeper as battery technology advances.
Yeah, and I think it's a kind of yes and approach to all of it, right? On the sustainable aviation fuel side of things in particular, that's definitely going to take an international approach. That's what I mean when I talk about there being enough sufficient buyer side demand. There are all these issues with feedstocks and who's providing what, and the way that the fuel itself is going to be purchased and how that's coordinated across different nations. And obviously those are long haul flights that we're talking about, a little bit different than what we've been discussing today. And that is a significant portion. This is why I'm sure you're thinking about a significant portion of the pollution and the greenhouse gas emissions that we're seeing in the transportation sector broadly, but specifically in aviation. Other questions? I see this lady here.
I'm so excited for this panel. I'm a former private pilot that changed my career path from commercial aviation to sustainability and climate justice. I've worked for a public hospital, level 1 trauma center in Northeast Ohio called the Metro Health System that is would be very much interested in the fast point-to-point emergency kind of transportation you're talking about. And now I work for the city of Cleveland, and we're very interested in how we can decarbonize our international airport, but we also have a private airport. Well, we have a public airport that serves private jets. I'll put it that way. So my big question is, as a city policymaker, as we look to prioritize things like transit-oriented development, what does that look like in the air? What is the conversation in the air around this excellent technology and prioritizing the greatest benefit on the equity side? What does public transit look like in the air with this technology, I guess is my question. Making room for the emergency, fast, point-to-point medical services that you mentioned, I think are very key as well.
I think this is one for Nikhil.
It's a great question. You know, it's not one I've thought too much about. You know, I think our first priority is how do we get the costs down? And so if we want to go enable mass public transit in the air, the thing that has to be true is it needs to be sustainable. Not sustainable from a environmental perspective, even though that has to be true as well, but from a cost perspective. And typically, at least in my experience, and as I think about what we did at Uber, the way we did that was we first launched as a private solution, right? We first launched in places like New York and London and Los Angeles, and that started arguably as a premium service where people had to pull out their phones, they had to pay a decent amount of money above a taxi for a black town car. Over time, we then launched UberX, which allowed anybody to become a driver. And that went from $5 a passenger mile to about $2 a passenger mile, so about 40% of the cost. Then we launched Uber Pool, where we said, hey, a lot of these trips are going to and from the same destination. Why don't people share cars? And then the cost went from $2 a mile to about half of that again. And that's when we started talking to city governments who said, hey, there are certain times a day where it doesn't make sense to run a bus because the bus has 40 seats and there's only 2 to 3 people on an average. It doesn't make sense to run a subway or even think about building a light rail. Why don't we use Ubers instead? And then we got to hook into the commuter benefits that other cities offered and said, hey, instead of using public funds to build really expensive light rail solutions or buy a bunch of buses, why don't you use that money to help subsidize Ubers instead and make it a lot more efficient? And also, by the way, now we don't have to deal with fixed infrastructure, but you can sort of dynamically use software that the private sector is funding to go optimize the public sector trips. So that's what happened at Uber. I think the same story can happen in the air, where again, we'll probably launch as a relatively premium service in big cities. If we do our jobs right, I hope that cost, and we're planning for that cost to come down to the same level as a taxi or below. And that's where it gets really interesting for cities to say, hey, maybe we should go put public funds into building a mass transit solution where you can go from A to B in the air.
Super interesting. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll have closing thoughts from everybody. Who wants the last question? Yes, sir.
Hi. I've often wondered if we're going to electrify aviation, can we take advantage of that and build purpose-built firefighting aircraft that are unmanned, that send quick, like they could be alert 5 at every airport and just get there right away and tackle it. They can go on heat signatures through smoke, etc.
I think we already are. You know, I just met a fascinating company that's doing this for police response. So when there is an incident, say a break-in or reported gunfire, et cetera, instead of sending 2 men or women in a cop car barreling down the highway, they'll just send a drone. The drone will be there in 60 seconds and it'll provide high fidelity camera footage back to somebody in a control center and determine what sort of next steps are required for the response. There are already drones doing this for fire response. If you hear, you know, if there are reports of a forest fire or if there's a building on fire, that can start to assess the situation and in some cases even start to you know, apply water or other chemicals to help put it out. So that's already happening in spades, and I'm really excited to see that continue to happen.
It's a great question. It is absolutely happening. So firefighting is one application. There's another where essentially using drones to transport people instead of an ambulance on a first response basis is actually in testing right now. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes. There's multiple applications kind of across the spectrum. And we didn't even touch on the cargo part of it here today. But if you live in the Dallas metro area today, Walmart will actually deliver by drone packages. So the point is there's applications kind of across the board on the emergency medical, firefighting, and response side, some very exciting possibilities.
All right, so we're going to close it out with just 20 seconds each on one message that you want to make sure that this group of climate advocates and activists and policymakers takes away with them. Bill, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think I'll take a step back, and we've had some of these elements before of lots of downtown vertiports and things like that, and we don't have as many today as we did in the past for lots of reasons, right? So, we all, right, OEMs, operators, state, federal, local governments, regulators, right, and I mean even the traveling public at large, right? We all have to collectively think about what's going to be different this time.
Yeah, look, flying cars are here. They're coming. You'll be able to ride in one as soon as next year. And everyone in this room can play a part, whether it's go get a job in the space or call your local congressman or senator and make sure she or he is excited about bringing flying cars to wherever you live.
Thank you. John, last word.
Let's learn from our hard-learned lessons on surface transportation decarbonization. Let's have a consistent, thoughtful approach, uniform standards, consistency and predictability in regulation, and as we do with the rest of the transportation system, for equity purposes, it should be subsidized where it actually makes sense. So let's build on the lessons that from some of the stumbles we've made in trying to decarbonize surface transportation.
No more stumbles. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you.